Hello. Good morning. Welcome to our first session today. Hope everyone slept well. It is my pleasure to introduce you our first speaker, whose name is Barry. I'm afraid I don't know that much about his actual story, but that's good because he can tell it much better than I can. But I know that he's an excellent storyteller and an evangelist, so you guys are in for a treat. So get yourselves comfortable. If you've got your notepads, if you want to take notes. If not, just take it in and let what Barry says speak to you individually. All right, Barry?
Can we just move some of this back? Yeah, cheers. Yeah, so I can get in front of it. A bit more, mate. Cheers. Good morning. You okay? I like loads of rooms, so I'll kind of... Well, it's great to be with you this morning. I just want to thank Kath for inviting me to be part of this weekend's Fresh. It's already been mentioned that I am an evangelist full-time. I travel up and down the country. I speak at about 130 events a year. I speak in 30 prisons a year. And what I like to do, I like to communicate the relevance of Christianity using storytelling and humour. That's what I do. I've also wrote a book called Once an Addict, which I've got some copies there which we can practically give to everybody in here before I go, if I've got enough, just so that you can read something of my story. But this morning, Kath has asked me to speak on the subject that is the closest to my heart, and that's communicating faith. So during our time together, what we're going to do, we're going to look at the why and the how of communicating faith. Why do we do it and how do we do it? And then we're going to look at the why and the how of communicating faith using stories. Your own personal story. And Kath has asked me to tell my story at some point throughout the day. So what I want to do today, I want to give you some information, some kind of understanding of how to go about it. And then later, I'm going to model it by doing it. That's okay? And then you'll hear something of the story and how God has radically changed my life. And I hope as young leaders and as emerging young leaders that out of this morning you are kind of better informed on how to communicate, but also how you can then educate others who are coming through, who you are influencing. So let's start with communicating faith. Why do we communicate our faith? Number one, we do it because Jesus told us to do it. Simple as. In Mark chapter 16, verse 5, Jesus said, this is the Message version, go into all the world, go everywhere and announce the message of the good news to one and all. The NIV puts it this way, go into all the world and preach the good news. Communicate the good news. So we do it. Why? Number one, because Jesus told us to do it. One day this guy came to Louis Palau, who's a very famous evangelist based in America. He's from South America originally, an old-time evangelist. And he said to him, Louis, I'm waiting for the call before I go. And Louis said to him, what do you mean the call? He said, the call came 2,000 years ago. Jesus told us to do it, so that's why we get busy communicating our faith. Number two, we do it because God's love prompts us to do it. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 14, it says, for Christ's love compels us because we are convinced that one died for all. The love of Christ that we've received compels us to communicate the relevance of Christianity. Has anybody ever heard of a guy called Nicky Cruz? I've heard of Nicky Cruz. He's been around for 1,000 years. But his story is still relevant. I read his book recently, and some of the language isn't relevant to us in the 21st century because he used to jitterbug. jitterbug through the streets of the Bronx, and we don't jitterbug anymore, but actually the power of the story is still relevant. And his story is that he was this gang leader in New York, and this pastor went to reach out to him to communicate the Christian faith, and he was having none of it. David Wilkerson was the pastor's name. And he kept going to Nicky, he kept saying to Nicky, "Nicky, God loves you." And then he says, "What do you tell me about your God? God doesn't love me." And then he'd meet him again and say, "Nicky, God loves you. And don't you tell." And he was going to have a go at this pastor. And one day, David Wilkerson had been speaking on the streets in New York, and Nicky Cruz was at the back with his gang. And again, after he finished speaking, he went up to Nicky Cruz and he said, "Nicky, God loves you." He said, "Stop telling me that God loves you. If you tell me one more time, I'm going to cut you into 1,000 pieces and throw you in the street." And David Wilkinson says, "You can cut me into 1,000 pieces and throw them in the street, but every one of those pieces will still love you." See, we do it because God's love prompts us to do it. God's love prompts us to do it. We do it because lost people matter to God. We all know that verse, John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son." We do it because lost people, lost meaning those outside of the church, those outside of a relationship with God, those people matter so much to God. I remember when I was a student at Cliff College. In fact, I used to come to this church on Sundays to speak every now and again. And I loved my time at Cliff College. And I remember arriving home after a busy term. It was Christmas, so I was getting loads of phone calls. "Barry, do you want to come out on Christmas Eve?" "No, I don't want to go out on Christmas Eve." Another phone call. "Barry, do you want to come out on Christmas Eve?" "No, I don't want to go out on Christmas Eve." On one afternoon, I thought to myself, what would Jesus do if he was here to celebrate his own birthday? He'd probably be out there speaking to lost people. So I said to my friend John, "John," he says, "What?" I said, "John, on Christmas Eve, I've got an idea. Do you fancy coming with me?" He says, "Tell me about it first." I says, "Well, on Christmas Eve, I'm going to go onto the streets of Manchester. I'm going to reach out to two specific groups. I'm going to reach out to the tramps and prostitutes. Two specific groups of lost people. Do you want to come with me?" "Yeah, I'll come with you." I was speaking in Durnley Methodist Church on one of the Sundays, and I happened to be taking the whole service. I know that Methodists like to get their money's worth. You know, you don't just turn up to speak, you take the whole service. And during that service, I actually said, on Christmas Eve, I'm going to go out and reach two specific lost groups, tramps and prostitutes. And then 5 minutes after that, one of the deacons in the church stands up and stops me. He says, hang on a minute. You've heard what Barry said he's going to do on Christmas Eve. Can we take up an offering?" That doesn't happen in Methodist churches. They took up an offering, 30 quid. I thought, I've arrived. Quid's in, £30. And then I was speaking in the evening at another church, and I mentioned it there, and they gave me some money. And in the end, I had a pot of money, about 120 quid. I thought, I'm going to go and use this on the streets of Manchester, reaching two specific lost groups of people. Tramps and prostitutes. So we bought loads of stuff. And me and John set out about 11:30 at night. And we had about 3 conversations with 3 proper tramps. I'm not talking about the guys who sell the big issue and make more money than what I do. I'm talking about proper tramps. People who lived under doorways. Literally, one lived behind this piece of mesh under a doorway behind one of the restaurants in Chinatown. Do you know what? He used to be a policeman. Imagine that. Being a policeman and ended up a tramp. He told us his story. That he had a big bust-up with his wife. No way was he going to get back with it, and he couldn't handle the thought of never being back with his wife. And now, he's there, living behind this mesh, under a doorway. Spent about an hour and a half with him. And we toddled off, and we met this other tramp. He told us his story. He was living in a caravan in Cheetham Hill. And then I said to John about 1:30 in the morning, I says, come on, John, we're going to go and speak to some prostitutes. Sackville Street, Manchester, where all the prostitutes work. We're walking down Sackville Street. Me and John, and I heard the words behind me. Do you want to do business, mate? And I looked round and I says, no, you're all right, love, I don't want to do business. And we both carried on walking. 2 minutes later, are you sure you don't want to do business? No, you're all right, love, I don't want to do business. Carried on walking. Are you blankety blank sure you don't want to do business? It's freezing out here. I stopped. She came running over to me. I says, listen, love, I don't want to do business. But I will pay £20 for 20 minutes of your time. What do you mean? Well, I'm a Christian, and if I can take you into the cafe on Piccadilly and chat with you for 20 minutes, I'll give you 20 quid. She said, oh yeah, that'd be great. But I can't go into the cafe because my fella is watching me, my man. But I can go in the doorway over the road there. Okay, I remember, I'll never forget this as long as I live. We walked towards the doorway, and as she stepped back into the doorway, she kind of went like that on the floor, and she looked up. I looked down at her, and the light shone in her face. All her hair was matted, black hair. Her teeth were yellow. Her lipstick was smudged. And I looked at her and I said, tell me your story. Oh, you want to know my story? I'll tell you my story. But I better be quick because my man is watching me. My fella is over the road. And I looked over the road and there was a guy stood there with a baseball cap on, watching. And I looked at him and he came walking towards me. And I kept looking him in the eye because I'm thinking, he that's in me is better and stronger than he that's in the world. I'm not going to be intimidated by you. And he got that close to my face. And for a moment, just a moment, I thought, I just wish I wasn't a Christian. And if you know what I'm thinking, I just wish for 10 minutes. That's all it'd take, and then I could come back to your God, but it doesn't work like that. And she said, it's all right, he's just talking to me. Very obvious. He was communicating, he's just talking to me. He went, okay, and he walked back to his spot on the other side of the road. Carry on, tell me your story. And she told me a story how she got involved with this guy. She was a drug user, he was a drug user, and he started putting her on the streets to make money to provide drugs for their addiction. And then she carried on telling me her story, and she rolled her sleeves up and she says, look at all my arms, they're full of cigarette burns. My man has done that because he loves me that much. And I was just listening. I wasn't saying a word, just listening to her tell a story. She said, I've got a daughter who I've not seen for years because my man told her that I was a prostitute and she doesn't want to know me. And I listened to a story. And after 20 minutes, I put my hand in my pocket and I pulled out 20 quid. And I said, thank you for your time. It's been great to hear your story. And then I pulled out like a little leaflet that had the Christian message on in a very contemporary way. And I said, promise me you'll read that when you get home, because I'm a Christian. And I just want you to read that because that's a message for you. She said, oh, I'll read that. And I gave her that as well. Do you know what she said? She looked up at me from that little doorway. No man has ever done that for me before. No man has ever given me money without wanting something in return. Tears streaming down her face. I remember walking around the corner with John, heading towards the car. And I'd been praying these kind of prayers like you do. God, give me eyes to see how you see. Give me ears to hear how you hear. Help me feel the way that you feel. And I was reminded of that prayer as I walked around the corner because God said to me, you wanted to hear how I hear? You wanted to see how I see? You want to feel how I feel? This is how I felt. And all of a sudden I felt a compassion and I started to cry as a big, hard, ex-Manchester drug dealer. I cried. See, the reason why I went out onto the streets early hours of Christmas morning with John is because lost people matter to God. And if we don't go, who's going to go? And I know that your particular group might not be those two groups, great. But we can all reach our peers. We're all in our own little communities. We were talking about this before. Your school, your college, your youth group, your work, wherever it may be, that could be where you can actually say to somebody, tell me your story. Because people like it when you're interested in them. When you show interest in others, they like that. How many of you know that it's good to talk, people like to talk about themselves? So when you show interest in them, tell me your story. Build the bridge. I mean, I'm going right off my notes here, but lost people matter to God. That's why we do what we do. That's why we communicate our faith. And number 4, we do it because we have found something that's good, and we should want to share that. Taking that drug, you know, I found something, and we've got something that's so much better than any drug. And we should want to spread the word. We should want to get that word out. We should want to share that with others. So, that's the why. So let's look at the how. How do we communicate our faith? Very quickly, number 1, we do it through our lifestyle. If you're calling yourself a Christian and you're giving yourself a Christian tag, remember this, that people are watching you. And before anybody's going to read the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, they're going to read the Gospel of Lisa, Lucy and Bob. They are. They're going to read the Gospel of you first. So if you're calling yourself a Christian and you're not responding in the way that Christians are supposed to respond, in certain situations, that's not a good way of communicating your faith. But if you're responding in a positive way, that is probably one of the best ways that you can communicate Christianity, through your lifestyle. Yeah? Number 2, we communicate it through our words. Jesus said, as we read before, go everywhere and announce the message of God. And I don't think Jesus is suggesting that we all start wearing sandwich boards and carrying megaphones, because I don't think that way of communicating the Christian faith works that much. God can use it, but it doesn't really paint us in a good light, does it? I think if we go about it naturally, that's the best way. That's the best way that we can communicate. Natural. In those natural areas of contact, wherever they may be, we just do it naturally. Another way that we can go about sharing our faith is we do it creatively. And that's what I like about Share Jesus International. When Rob Frost was around and Andy and all of that, over the years, it's been known for being a creative organisation. So many creative ways of communicating the faith. In fact, when I became a Christian, before I was a Christian, I was into dance music. I'll tell you this bit of the story later on. And I had a little dance music studio in my flat in Moss Side, and then I started to use decks to DJ, and eventually I stopped DJing, and then I became a Christian. I got a place at Cliff College for 1 year. I remember being taken to my first house group, and the leader was a guy called Andy Smith. His dad's called Paul Smith, quite a big hitter within the Methodist Church. And Andy Smith was an evangelist at Cliff College, and I walked into Andy's flat, which was on the premises, and in the corner were some Technics 1210s turntables, a mixer, and some records. I said, Andy, you into DJing? He says, yeah, I am. I said, so am I. And Andy carried on chatting to the people in his living room, and I went into the corner. I turned on the decks, and I got a couple of tunes, put them on, and straight away it was in time and in key. Can you DJ proper? I said, yeah, I can DJ proper. He says, you want to start using that to communicate your faith? Oh, I don't know about that. No, I don't know about that. Because I had 3 loves before I was a Christian in this order: drugs, dance music, and Lisa. So it was a massive, big issue to me because I was immersed in it. That was my culture. I loved it. Andy's saying to me, I need to use that again. I thought, oh no. And in those days, Cliff College, and I think they still do something similar today, the name may change. It used to be called Late Night Extra. At their festivals, they used to do 2 festivals a year. And Andy said to me, will you DJ at Late Night Extra? I says, okay. And I DJ'd at Late Night Extra, and I saw all these young people getting it. I was playing secular music. I wasn't playing Christian music. I was playing secular music. And I had some very rare vinyl, Martin Luther King vinyl. And I play this secular music, and I've come back to tell you that you are a somebody. And I saw the potential in it, because people were dancing, and I was communicating my faith through the music. And I said to God, God, if this is of you, I need my own turntables. I don't want to be using Andy's. I went home for one of our terms, and guess what? I got a cheque for £1,000 through the post. So I bought my own turntables, and I started to collect vinyl again. And that became a way that I communicated my Christian faith. I even went to Ibiza. The year 2000, I took a team of 10 people to Ibiza, communicating the relevance of Christianity through dance music. Then I went back in the year 2001 with 2 teams of 10 people, again, communicating the relevance of Christianity through dance music. This is just one of the ways that we can communicate our faith. Be creative. I think now, if you just break up into 2s or 3s and think of different ways that you can be creative, think of all the different ways, all the different mediums, all the different things that are out there today, how can you communicate the relevance of Christianity creatively? And also, how can you equip others to do it? So if you're a leader, you've got a youth group, or you're an emerging leader, how in the future can you get somebody thinking about his creativity or her creativity? How can you enable them to get busy using that to communicate faith? 5 minutes. Bit of music on, brilliant. You as an individual creatively communicate the Christian faith, and what way can you enable others to do the same? Who's going to start us off? What have you got written down, or any ideas that came up? Yep. Facebook. Fantastic. Fantastic. And how would you do that? Would you set up a page, or would you do it just... Yeah. Brilliant. Great, and you get interaction through that as well. Yeah. So you're getting people to think, and that creates dialogue. And what kind of response do you get with something with that? Yeah, okay. That's great. Yeah. And is it like, how many likes have you got on the page? Or is it a personal page? Oh, it's a group. Okay, so is it the new style group? Right. Yeah, okay. Great stuff. Fantastic. Well, that's great, because that's the now thing, isn't it? And people are into, dialogue, and that's the great thing about Facebook in many ways, but certainly for communicating your faith. Anything else? Any other ideas came up? Yep. Yep. Drama and arts.
Well, it's very thinking about how you can express yourself to them, so express how you feel in your story, and then encourage people to interact with that, and then kind of express their story to them.
Wow, that's great. So it's not just you doing a performance that's going to communicate the faith, it's you enabling others to create their own drama using their own story.
With art, you get prints out and stuff, and just let them give them a theme or an idea, and then or how they feel through that.
Fantastic. And is that something you're going to do, or is it something you do, or is it just an idea that's come?
That's when the drama works, so that's something I've wanted to do.
Right. Great. Brilliant. Anything else? Any others? Yeah. Fashion? So tell me how you would go about that then. Great. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Fantastic. That's great. See, I've not heard of that one before. I've not heard of that, the two ways of that, but that's fantastic. Brilliant. And is that something you could do? Just an idea that's come now, or an idea you've been thinking about for a while?
It's like little aspects. I've got a uncle on that quite a lot of stuff at school.
Yeah.
Like, first got like social algorithm somewhere out.
Yeah.
Different things. I know one person had a bully that was like crazy,
Fantastic. Great stuff. Great way, that, isn't it? Brilliant. Any others? Yeah. Yeah.
Like actually engaging with different communities and cultures. Sometimes like feels like Christianity is better for like subculture
Yeah.
that we like introduce people to. So like often like you were saying, just going and getting involved in a good way in what other people do, so people are interested in bound with that kind of music or doing certain things.
Yeah.
Actually not becoming part of it in that sense, but going and doing stuff, hanging out with them and learning like their language in the same way.
Totally.
In a country, you have to learn the language
Yeah.
and the culture.
Totally.
If you've got friends in music or art or something, go, hey, you know, I want to come and learn about your particular culture.
Yeah. And it's that incarnational thing, isn't it? About being in the middle of it, being in it. And I think, because I work a lot still in prisons and work with kind of some of the people that, you know, my old peers, if you call them that, or old criminal friends or whatever. And I go into their world, and I'm conscious that I'm in their world. It used to be my world, and I'm like being incarnational. I'm in the thick of it, and they're using language that I won't use, but I'm not going to diss them for using the language because I'm in their world. I've been in with a chaplain once who said, "Don't swear in front of me." And I walked away, I thought, how arrogant can you get? I mean, I know that we don't use that kind of language, or we're not supposed to use that kind of language, but it's like, you're in their world, and what do they think about you when you say that? They think you're a snob, you know? And and obviously, I think God gives us certain graces for certain things, like when we were in Ibiza, we saw things out there that I just couldn't repeat, you know? And I remember one of the guys, Barry Johnson, who was one of my team, he said, I feel slimed. He used that word, I feel slimed, because we've been in, but we were aware that we were under a certain grace to do that. And God was using us and protecting us as we unfolded the message of Christianity. But that's exactly, and I think we need to do more of that. We need to be in these places, but being conscious that we're God's representatives. And whichever it may be, you know what I mean? Whatever culture that might be, whatever your culture is. Because we're all got our own little worlds, haven't we? You know, I mean, for some of you, dance music may be way off the charts, but something else, you know, exercising, or, you know, that's something that you were telling me you're doing, which is fantastic. Mm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any others? Yeah.
We were kind of talking more about thinking about what has happened in the past with churches at the moment and so on, and how it's gone out. And a lot of that was all going into the community and doing things as opposed to saying things.
Yeah.
So actually, the church being at the centre of the community, but not being wanted.
Yeah.
You see so many churches that have like the optimum position in the town.
And they don't make the best of it. Yeah.
And they're not part of the community.
Yeah.
And that's so sad because you can see the potential that they could have with the people there.
Yeah.
And it always encourages me to see churches that are in shops, packaging shops, and they know everyone in the community. They're
Yeah.
actually going and helping out friends, but not saying, you know what, I'm a Christian and I'm doing it because I'm a Christian.
That's right. Being natural.
Yeah, being natural.
Yeah.
And being able to communicate
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
through action.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that was that there was really good 3 years ago in Professional on Good Friday, which lots of people have done before, but it was so simple, just walking from one place to another, and every sort of mile or so we just stopped, and everyone bowed in front of the cross that we were carrying, and we just stayed there for like 2 minutes.
Wow.
People were walking past and like, what's going on here? But we weren't speaking, it was really kind of overt, like, whoa. But it made me think, they're not sitting inside a church on Good Friday,
Mm.
They're actually out there trying to say, this is just like changed my life. He's died 2,000
Yeah, yeah,
years
yeah.
ago today.
Superb.
But we're talking about it now.
Yeah.
And we're not going to
Mhm.
sit down to the table and pray about
Yeah.
it. And that's for me, that's the most effective way of actually getting in the community.
Yeah. Actions speak louder than words most of the time, don't they?
Yeah.
One of the things that came to mind there as you were saying that, we have an office, I have two offices, I have one in Rochdale and one in Salford. Some of you may be aware of Media City, which is a big thing that started in the north of England, where they've moved some of the main departments from the BBC in London up to Manchester, and now Granada are building their studios, and it is a Media City, and our offices are literally looking over Media City, and it's owned by a private company. So when you go into any town, you can get permission to, if you wanted to go and do a performance in Chesterfield, you could get permission, you could go and do your performance. Well, this is different. You can't, with this guy, you can't do anything. And I was walking around there when we first moved our offices, because we're thinking long term of creative ways of connecting with the media. Because I do little bits with the media, I do the odd interview and stuff like that. But kind of how can we connect with the media down there? And one of the ideas that we've got, we've called the freeze, where we're going to have like maybe 60 or 70 people, probably more than that, who are just going to be regular people like you and me, going to be walking, and all of a sudden, wherever there's going to be a sound, and they're going to stop. All these people are going to stop in the midst of this crowd to create an interest, and then they're going to start again doing their own thing. So there'll just be, and there's not going to be no message to it. It's just an awareness thing, and then we might have some kind of where there'll be something that they can make contact with, some kind of website that we set up, so then they can look, so they can take it the next step. But because I've been into the studios and I know how they set out, so I can imagine that happening. The people in the media going, what's going on there? So it's an awareness thing, and then that could create an interest. So we're trying to hook them in, really. But whatever we do at the end of the hook, it's got to be relevant, and it's got to be 21st century. It's not going to be like something that's going to, because the media don't like religion anyhow. So that's just one idea. Oh, just as well, just to mention, I've mentioned that I wrote a book, Once an Addict. I wrote this in 2007, or 2006. It was published in 2007. And when it came out, I said to my trustees, I want to start a project. I want to be creative in the way that I use this book. I'm going to use it to communicate faith. And we started a project to raise funds to send a copy of this to every single prisoner in the UK. At the time, there was 97 prisoners behind bars, and we have to date sent 34,000 copies of this out to prisoners. That's just one way. It's a book, it's creative, dead simple. Obviously, there's money involved with that, and I'm busy raising money and doing what I need to do to get money to make that happen. The trust is, but I'm heading that up. But that's just a simple idea. And we get letter after letter after letter of people who found faith through reading this book. I was telling, what's your name again? Paul earlier on, a story about a guy who works in Buckley Hall Prison, who's a pastor of a church, but he's also a part-time chaplain. And I spoke at an event at his church about 3 weeks ago, and he came up to me and he says, I've not told you about that guy in our prison from Bolton, have you? I says, no. He says, well, a guy came in from Bolton, he's still in today. He can't read or write. He opened your book and he found that he could read it. He read the whole book, prayed the prayer at the end, became a Christian, and now he's reading the Bible. Wow! Wow! This was only a few weeks ago he told me this. Wow! Started with a little idea, creative idea. I was speaking in Wales. I get all over the country. I love doing what I'm doing, speaking at all these events. And after I spoke at this place in Wales, this guy came up to me. He says, do you remember me? I says, no, I don't remember you. He says, you will remember me when I tell you this. Go on. He says, you came to visit me when I was in Perth prison, when I was in solitary confinement. As soon as he said that, I remembered. Because I've only ever visited one person in solitary confinement during my prison visits. I usually speak to the guys and spend some time with them, and then I'm off. I never get taken to a cell. I says, yeah, I remember that. This guy had become a Christian through reading my book in solitary confinement. And he couldn't come to the main meeting because he was in solitary confinement. And the woman who organised the event says, will you come down and meet this guy, Dave? He's become a Christian through your book, he's in solitary confinement, and he's dying to meet. I said, yeah, and I went down, I sat with him, and I prayed a little bit with him, and chatted with him. 5 years later, the other month, in Wales, he comes up to me. I remember now, yeah. He says, well, I'm an outreach worker now. in a church in South Wales, Swansea. And you know what? He brought about 10 or 12 addicts with him to the event that I was speaking at, and some of them responded. Creative ideas. That's just 2 stories. I could give you story after story after story that people have found faith through a little idea. See, it's all right having the idea, but it's being intentional about making that idea become a reality. And sticking to it. Stick to it like a postage stamp. You know, I could have easily got caught off with other projects, but I'm one of those that likes to commit to something and see it all the way through. So 97,000, we've done 34,000, we've still got quite a few thousand to go yet. There's a million one things I could get involved with, but I'm not, because I'm focused. And when you focus on something, the fruit comes. You start having an idea and starting it and then finish it and forgetting about it, you're never going to get anywhere. What does J. John say? Sometimes I've got so many irons in the fire, I put the fire out. Another idea that I came up with, I was getting invited to do lots of schools, and I'm so busy now, my diary is busy for the next year, literally, and beyond, for speaking engagements, and people were ringing and saying, we come and do this school, and we come and speak. And I used to do schools work many years ago, but kind of something I've put down and started doing other types of events, the prisons and outreach events. So I said to the guys, we'll produce a resource for school teachers to use. So we'd already produced a DVD, Once an Addict, which is a documentary version of my story, which is in every prison and in every school in Manchester. We obviously funds, going to get it into every school in the UK. We already had the DVD, so okay, if I can't get into schools, what can I do? Let's think creative. I can produce some lesson plans for teachers to use. So I nobbled this RS teacher, and I says, will you help me? And basically, he took my story, and out of my story, he's produced lesson plans. National curriculum based. There's 7 lesson plans. Number 1, again, number 1 is about drugs. Number 2 is about drugs. Number 3 is about drugs. Number 4 is special revelation and the nature of God related to my story. Evil and suffering, all kind of mainstream subjects. These other 2 here, sexual relationships and marriage, crime and punishment. These are all subjects that you do in RS, but he's related it to my story. Just another creative idea. Creative idea, and I don't have to be there. It's great. In fact, I just spoke in a prison a couple of weeks ago in York, and I got into my car and I'm just kind of tweeting about it. I had a great time, and at the same time, checked my Facebook before I set off, and then the next minute, somebody tweets me, and it was a girl saying, just watching Barry Woodward's DVD in school. Look forward to seeing you next year, because I'm going to this sixth form college, whatever it is, next year. And I'm thinking, isn't that amazing? I've just spoken in a prison here in York, and there I am in the school in Manchester. So it just shows you can be more places than once, because I'm not omnipresent, by the way. I can be omnipresent if I get creative. Books in one place. So just shows ideas. Okay, I don't want to cover all of what I plan to say today, because obviously when we start to interact and other things happen, that's how it should be, isn't it? Because it's a two-way thing. It's not just about me standing up and having all the answers. But another way that we can communicate faith, we're going to finish at 11:15, and then we'll have a little bit more. But what I might do, I might tell you some of my story, but it'd be great to hear some of you tell your stories. Who'd be up for that? Anybody? Even when you've had some pointers on how to do it, if I give you some really constructive help on how you can best tell your story, would you be up for standing up and saying, okay, I'm going to do my story in 5 minutes? All right, I'll ask you that again after I've done some. Okay, we've got one already. But no, it's good, because it's about enabling you to get more confident, because I stand up front all the time doing what I do, you know? And it'd be great to, and I'm sure some of you are wanting to be doing stuff up front, or you are doing stuff up front, and you want to get more confident at it. So it's good that you can just take some of these things away. Another way that we communicate our faith is through our personal stories. And I'm an associate with J. John. Anybody know? Well, if you go to Soul Survivor, you'll know J. John. He's my mentor, and he's kind of on my board of directors for Proclaim Trust, and I've been linked with him for about 8 years now. And every year we go to a retreat. And in the old days, we used to go to Hartwell House, which is really posh, down kind of Oxford way. Really posh. And he had somebody who would subsidise this, and we'd pay practically buttons just to get there. And in the evening, you'd have to wear a suit, and it would be all this proper silver stuff, you know. I'm thinking, oh, would they miss that if I nicked it? Keep my ministry going for a few weeks, that would. And I'm kind of like, and one day somebody came up with the idea, why don't we write a book together, John? Sat around this table, about 15 of his evangelists, and John and Andy Kadamides, and a couple of his staff. And he says, yeah, what a great idea. And then he went, okay, well, you can write a chapter on this, and you can write a chapter on that, and you can write a chapter on this. Then he said to me, and you can write a chapter on telling your story. So he pigeonholed me. And in a way, we're all doing a bit of what each other is doing, but it's right that he pigeonholed us to do what we were specialising in. And out of that, we produced a book called More Ways Than One. You like that book, dear? And that's basically 15 guys' personal perspective on how we can communicate faith in the 21st century in post-modern Britain, UK and internationally as well, because there's stuff about working overseas and all that in there. More Ways Than One. I didn't have any with me, otherwise I'd have brought some of those. I've ran out, but we're waiting for some more stock to arrive. But off the back of that, it got me thinking that obviously because I've got the story that I've got, then when I sat down and wrote that chapter, it helped me. I have had an understanding of it because I studied storytelling at Cliff College. I've always majored on storytelling and all of that. And it was kind of like, it helped me put a theology into what I do. And I'm going to share some of that with you today. So I'll start with the introduction, then we're going to have a break, and then we'll come back and we'll just look at some of it. And then we're going to get you to tell your story, and then to finish, I will tell my story. And it's probably just to kind of, I can model a little bit of what I'm going to say, but more to do with so that you get to grips with where I've come from and the power of a personal story and how that can affect people's lives. So I've realized this as well, that when people invite me to speak at a church these days, and you've got a book out called Once an Addict, they don't expect you to come and teach on the Beatitudes. They want to hear your story no matter what, and I understand that. I remember Vinnie Jones was being interviewed on the television. He was doing this interview, and the interviewer said to him, do you ever get worried about being typecast? And he says, no, not at all. He says, when people come to see me in a film, they expect to see a hard man. They don't expect to see me as an office worker. I give them what they want. And when he said that, I thought, that's just like me. When people come to hear me speak, they don't come to hear me talk on the Beatitudes. They come to hear my story, so I give them what they want. But I don't just do it the same way all of the time. I find different ways of presenting that story so that it's not always the same. The truths are always the same, but the framework and presentation can be different. Because I don't just want it to be the same old. I'm working on one at the moment. In fact, I did some work on it this morning before I come. It's called Life in Retrospect. And I look at life in retrospect and I tell some of my stories. And each one of those stories has a lesson. Count the cost of your choices is the one I've been working on this morning. It'll take me a while to formulate this, to get it to exactly how I want it, and then eventually it's there. Another way of telling my story. That's one of my points. Count the cost of your choices. Align with your assignment. That's what some of you guys are here for. You were telling me about that book before, Paul, wherever he's gone, about helping you to align with your assignment. What's your gifting? We've all got on assignment, and I use my story to make that point. So it's like a keynote speech. It's not just, my story. It's more than that, but that's something that I've not even started to do yet. I'm just working with that now. So do you like to listen to people's stories? Do you like stories? Everybody's interested in stories. If you went into a bookshop, you could look at the top shelf, and I bet you, even though I don't bet, that probably those on the top of the list are biographies. See, people are interested in other people's stories, including you. Stories. The media realise that people are interested in other people's stories. One newspaper's motto is this: people want to read about people, so they produce stories about people. I've got a Facebook page, I've got a personal Facebook page, the Trust has got a Facebook page, and when I post stories, I get the most likes. I can say something that I think is really smart, and I get some likes, but if I post a story about a tattoo artist who's just responded, who's just become a Christian, 150 likes. Say something that I think's really smart, 30 likes. See, people are more interested in people's stories. People like to hear about other people's stories. This is nothing new. Many years ago, Jesus himself knew that people like to hear about other people's stories. That's why when he was teaching and preaching, he told stories, usually about people. So now let's look at the why and how of personal stories. Why your personal story is important and how you go about delivering it. We'll just get into this first bit and then we'll stop. And I'm sure that a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be helpful for some of you. Have we got any communicators in here? Great. Have we got any people who think they're going to be communicators in the future? I'd get your pens out. Because I want to share everything. In fact, I have produced notes, but you're not having them till I've finished. I was saying to Paul before, when I was at Cliff College, Pete Phillips used to come in to do our New Testament, and he used to always produce really full notes, and he'd give them out before the lecture, and he'd just sit on the desk reading the notes, and I'd be thinking, why don't you just go back to your study and leave your notes there, and we can just read them, because he kind of stole his own thunder. So I'm going to give you these notes, but also you need to write notes, because of course I've said most of what I've said this morning isn't in my notes. So you're going to get more stuff than what you're going to get in the notes. So if you're a communicator or you feel you're going to be a communicator in the future, then you need to get your pens out, because I'm sure some of this stuff is going to help you. I wish somebody would have told me this stuff years ago. But probably it wasn't right then, and I needed to learn it to teach people like yourself. So the why of personal stories. 4 things why. Number 1, personal stories demonstrate relevance. Stories of human interest are an essential way of communicating today. Traditionally, we have called this type of story a testimony. That's a person's faith story. Some people think that telling your story is something that you outgrow. That's so far away from the truth. I was in this church, there was a guy in this church who I heard had a good story. And in those days I was spending maybe 3, and you've worked with me on some of these, aren't we? We used to do 3 days in venues, and we do Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday night. Aunt has done bits of worship for me in there. And there were smaller churches, and I would invite people to tell their stories. Some of them were bigger churches, but some of them were smaller churches, not the size of the church. And I heard that this guy in that church that I was in at that time had a good story. I said, I've heard you've got a good story. He said, yeah, I've got a good story. He says, will you come and tell it at one of my events? He said, oh, I don't know about that. I'll ring you and let you know. Not fine. Who does he think he is? Got a phone call 3 days later. I've been thinking about it, and I'm not going to tell my story at one of your events because that's something that I've outgrown. I said, okay. No worries. Put the phone down. That guy is still sat in the church doing nothing. Isn't it strange that he thought that he'd outgrown something, actually, that the media would draw towards? Storytelling. It's not something that you outgrow, it's something that you can develop and become better at. Personal stories demonstrate relevance. Never forget that. People connect with your story, then they can connect with the stuff that's going on around your story, and ultimately they can connect with God's story. Personal stories make truth more accessible. That's number 2. Few people are interested in abstract truth, but a story can concretize the same truth in a much stronger way. Our own personal stories can play a key role in our missional strategy of reaching the unreached with God's story, the good news of Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul realized this in his day, way back in the day. This is nothing new. Paul was responsible for writing the largest part of the New Testament. We know that, don't we? He was. Teaching aimed at Christians. Theologians call this, what he wrote in the New Testament, non-public kerygma. I'm getting deep now. Kerygma is the Greek word for proclamation. So this was teaching for those inside the church, non-public. private teaching to those who are in the faith. This is not the only way that Paul communicated. The book of Acts records Paul telling his life story 3 times. No doubt he told it more than that during his ministry. On each of these 3 occasions, he was speaking to those outside the church. So he didn't start talking about what he talked about in the book of Romans with those outside the church. What did he do? He told them his story. I was on that road on my way to Damascus. And a light appeared. Boom. He tells the story 3 times. This is what theologians call public kerygma. So you've got your non-public kerygma to those inside the church and the public proclamation to those outside the faith. The way that Paul communicated to a private audience was different than the way that he communicated to a public audience. When speaking to not yet Christians, more often than not, he used his own personal story to help people connect with God's story. That's a lesson, that, isn't it? He told his story to reach those outside the church. So personal stories make truth more accessible. Number 3, personal stories have power. Never forget that. Revelation 12:11 states, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. In a court of law, a witness is called to take the witness stand to give a testimony, an honest account of what they have seen and heard. This is what we are expected to do as Christians. To give our own personal account of our own little bit in God's story and to testify to what God has done in our life. A testimony in a court of law has power of a legal kind. A spiritual testimony has power of a spiritual kind. As this verse states, to overcome even the work of the evil one. In Luke 8:39, Jesus healed the demon-possessed man, and then he said to him, return home and tell how much God has done for you. So the man went and told how much Jesus had done for him. He became a living witness through his story. So personal stories have power. And we'll finish with this one. Personal stories are for everyone. I travel around the UK speaking at all these events every year. I've done that for the last 13, 14 years. And I meet so many people. And I don't think I've ever met 2 people who are the same. See, we've all got a personal story. Listen, your story is not my story. Your story is your story. Your story is unique to you. But I want to say this, your story is still relevant. You can connect with people that I can't connect with. And I can connect with people that you can connect with. We've all got a story to tell. Never forget that. And I want to say this, when I'm in prisons, I always say there are 2 kinds of people in the church. The saved froms and the kept froms. The saved froms are those people who can stand up and talk about what God has saved them from. We are the minority group. People with stories like mine. We are the minority group in the church. There are some of us, but we're... The other kind of person in the church are those who can stand up and talk about what God has kept them from. The people who've been kept from that stuff. You are the majority group in the church. So you've got the saved froms, you've got the kept froms. Both groups of people know that if they was to line themselves on top of that rule of perfection, they would each break the rule, because nobody's perfect. The Bible says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the standards that God wants us to live. So nobody's perfect. We're both aware of that. But the saved froms and the kept froms have got stories that are relevant. My wife comes from the south. But I won't hold that against her, Paul. She came from Surrey. Her story is completely different than mine. She was brought up on a council estate, had a rough upbringing, and her way of getting out of that was to study hard at school and get herself an education. She left school, college, university, ended up in Nottingham. She became a Christian when J. John was speaking in Nottingham. She started working for an organisation called the PACE Team who did skills work. They still do skills work. She was on that pay team for 6 years. She ended up living in Rochdale, based in Rochdale. That's where I met her. My story is completely different than hers. Her story is still relevant, though. She's from this group. She's been kept from all that stuff. Your story is relevant. It is. Don't think because you've not been on drugs or you've not done crime or you've not been in prison that your story doesn't matter. It does matter. Remember this. People can argue with your theology about God, but they can't argue with your experiences of God. You can be at school or at college or in your community, and people can diss your faith, and they can argue with your faith, but they can't argue with your experiences of God. And your experiences may be different than mine. As you'll hear later, mine was quite a radical experience that just changed the whole course of my life. Some of yours might be gradual. That's still relevant. Still relevant. And there might be a few incidents that happened when you was a young child that you can think that God was in that. Them experiences. Nobody can take them away from you. So, personal stories are for everyone. Let's leave it there and have a break and come back. And then I'm just going to speak for maybe 10 more minutes, maybe 5, 10 more minutes, just to give you some nuts and bolts on how to tell your story, and then I'll tell my story. Nice one.